This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. If you're wondering who I'm wearing, you're gonna have to hit me up directly because they ain't paying me enough for a verbal call out. You feel me? Here's what we got for y'all. The Supreme Court has been ruling on election cases all year long, and they ain't done yet. We'll tell you what to expect and how those rulings could affect the upcoming election. Plus, with children now participating in vaccine trials, how do those differ from trials with only adults? And more importantly, how do health experts keep kids safe? But first, here's what you need to know right now. The Senate is moving ahead tonight on a vote to confirm Amy Coney Barrett as a member of the nation's highest court. Tonight's confirmation, breaking down basically along party lines, would cement a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court. Democrats worry this conservative court will likely strike down progressive reforms on healthcare and workers' rights, and Republicans, for their part, have been pretty open about the long-lasting impact they hope for from this lifetime appointment.
A lot of what we've done over the last 4 years will be undone sooner or later by the next election. They won't be able to do much about this for a long time to come.
This confirmation vote comes just 8 days before an election that could take power out of the hands of Republicans. The time frame is especially notable since Senate Republicans refused to confirm a Supreme Court nominee from President Obama more than 200 days before the 2016 election, saying that nomination was just too close to Election Day and that voters should have their own say. This confirmation also comes just about a month after President Trump nominated Barrett for the court seat, making this the fastest Supreme Court confirmation to make its way through the Senate in modern history. Not the news we wanted heading into winter, but hospitalizations for COVID-19 across the US are up 40% over the last month. That means as of today, 41,000 Americans are hospitalized fighting the virus. Just Friday, the US hit a record high number of daily new cases of COVID-19. Major hotspots include Florida, Texas, California, and the upper Midwest. In response to this new spike, public health experts are urging Americans to stay vigilant against the virus, respect social distancing, and wear that mask, folks.
The virus is now raging in many parts of the country, and you have to ask the question, is that get together, particularly if you don't keep your distance and people don't wear masks, is it worth it if someone gets sick? And I think there's a reasonable chance that someone will if people aren't being careful.
Meanwhile, another outbreak at the highest levels of government, as 5 staff members for Vice President Mike Pence have now tested positive for COVID. Despite that, Pence himself is still attending Trump campaign rallies that were followed by a new spike in cases locally in states including Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Archbishop Wilton Gregory will become the first Black cardinal in the history of the Catholic Church, with Pope Francis announcing his addition to the church's highest governing body. It's a highly historical moment for the church, and it comes in a year that's seen racial justice and reckoning at the forefront, things Gregory hasn't been afraid to address publicly. He's been outspoken on controversial issues like the police killings of Black Americans and President Trump's photo op in front of the St. John Paul II National Shrine. Gregory serves as the Archbishop of Washington, D.C., a position previously filled by 2 men tarnished in sexual abuse scandals. Before his current post, he was the Archbishop of Atlanta. Gregory's position will become official during a ceremony at the Vatican on November 28th. The Supreme Court has been busy this year, issuing a number of rulings related to voting. And with a little more than a week left before Election Day, the nation's highest court is set to issue more rulings, and likely with a +1, Judge Amy Coney Barrett. Newsy's Sheer Tarlow breaks down how the court has ruled on elections cases so far and how that affects this highly unusual election season.
The U.S. Supreme Court has weighed in on a handful of legal battles over voting, in most cases siding with state laws. And so far, that has resulted in the High Court more often than not rejecting efforts to ease voting amid the pandemic.
When the issue gets as far as the Supreme Court, they are giving the states more freedom to do what they want, including, more freedom to make it harder to vote or to make the rules more restrictive. And, there's lots of different reasons when they may be doing that, but it appears to me that at least part of it is they just would rather trust the states.
Hundreds of lawsuits have been filed this year by Republicans, Democrats, and the presidential campaigns over the ground rules for the 2020 election. The legal battles surround issues like mail ballots, witness requirements, and signature match laws. The Trump campaign and Republicans have broadly resisted pandemic-driven changes to the voting rules. arguing mail ballots lead to fraud, despite little evidence to support the claim. The Biden campaign and Democrats have largely sought to offer more flexibility to voters during the outbreak, with party loyalists saying they're much more likely to vote early. Among the cases, the court's decision in April to block extended voting in Wisconsin. In June, the justices rejected Democratic efforts to expand voting by mail to all Texas voters, not just those over the age of 65, during the pandemic. And this month, the justices blocked curbside voting in Alabama and declined to suspend witness requirements in South Carolina. For voters in Idaho and Oregon, the justices blocked lower court orders that would have allowed groups to collect signatures online for ballot initiatives.
The decisions are important because that they give us some insight into how the Supreme Court is thinking about the election rules and how it's thinking about rules that are accommodating the pandemic.
Democrats have had some wins, though, but here too, the justices deferred to state courts. In August, the court said Rhode Island residents can vote by mail without witnesses, rejecting a GOP effort to keep the requirement in place. And earlier this month, the justices rejected a GOP effort in Maine to suspend ranked choice voting and clear the way for election officials in Montana to send mail-in ballots to the state's voters.
The court is going to have influence on how the election is administered. The caution there is that the number of votes that we're talking about are unlikely to be outcome determinative at the end of the day.
In the days before Election Day, the justices are set to issue more rulings, including whether the battleground states of Wisconsin and North Carolina can extend their deadlines for mail-in ballots. The legal wars are being fought while the court is set to welcome its ninth member, Judge Amy Coney Barrett. With 9 justices again on the bench, the 4-4 split seen in a Pennsylvania case is not likely to be seen again. In that case, the tie left in place a lower court order allowing Pennsylvania to count mail ballots received up to 3 days after Election Day. Republicans are challenging that ruling, and they're asking the Supreme Court to rule on the case before Election Day.
I think we're observing now that the Supreme Court, in its recent decisions where they're reviewing lower court decisions about loosening up, flexing on absentee ballot rules. It looks like the Supreme Court is trying to lock down what the laws are going to be before the election to try to reduce the amount of uncertainty over litigation afterwards.
Shira Tarlow, Newsy, Washington.
Our celestial neighbor is still holding on to secrets after all these billions of years. Not exactly the sign of a trusting relationship, right? The first trending topic kind of sounds like a joke already, so let's just jump into it, shall we? Kind of weird how we didn't notice this sooner, but apparently the moon is wet, y'all. The revelation came from a pair of studies published in the journal Nature Astronomy today. In one study, NASA used the Stratospheric Observatory for Infrared Astronomy, or SOFIA telescope, which was on an airplane, to detect water trapped in glass beads on sunlit surfaces of the moon. In the other study, researchers collected data from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter that found ice and permanently frozen cold traps in the shadowed areas of the moon. So what exactly does all of this mean? One of the studies lays out implications for future lunar missions. If astronauts get thirsty or need water for some other reason, they could theoretically tap into the moon's resources. You know, I can't wait to see bottled moon water pop up alongside asparagus and lemon water at my local Whole Foods. The injury and COVID-plagued 2020 NFL season added another casualty. Odell Beckham Jr. tore his ACL during the Bengals-Browns matchup Sunday night. OBJ went in to make a tackle after the Bengals defense picked off quarterback Baker Mayfield, and that's where things went wrong. The injury was first reported by Josina Anderson and was immediately followed by well wishes from folks around the league. Beckham, a 3-time Pro Bowler, has had a rough go of things since joining the Browns. In the 2019 season, he suffered a hip and groin injury in training camp. Beckham finishes this season with 23 receptions for 319 yards, 3 carries for 72 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Remember murder hornets? Of course you do. They were from an earlier chapter of the pandemic, and apparently They didn't just go away when we started worrying about the election and wildfires and the other signs of the apocalypse. A team of absolute heroes from the Washington State Department of Agriculture were able to take out the first nest of Asian giant hornets found in the US. After initially discovering the nest in Blaine, Washington, the team of entomologists trapped a few of those bad boys and then put tiny radios on them so they could be tracked. I wouldn't believe this nonsense if there wasn't actual video of a murder hornet sporting a walkie-talkie. The group then vacuumed out 85 hornets from a tree cavity. They collected 98 worker hornets in total. Entomologists hope this and future operations will keep the hornets from gaining a foothold in the Pacific Northwest because they suspect there are more. According to the Washington Department of Agriculture, Asian giant hornets are an invasive pest and a predator of honeybees. The department says if you live in the area, you should let them know if you spot an Asian giant hornet or a hornet's nest. Or you could do what I would have done and just run away. Up until recently, every US vaccine trial has had one thing in common. Nobody under the age of 16 has participated. That changed after pharmaceutical company Pfizer won approval to begin enrolling children as young as 12 years old in their vaccine trials. This brings up a few questions. How different are the children's vaccine trials from the ones with only adults? And should we even be doing clinical trials now, even though an adult vaccine hasn't been approved? Newsy's Kat Sandoval dug into these questions, so you don't have to.
COVID-19 children's vaccine clinical trials are underway. How different are these trials from adult ones? And should we be starting on trials on kids now before an adult vaccine is approved?
We're not cutting corners, that we're taking the safety precautions, every safety precaution we normally do, and that people should have confidence in the process.
Dr. Robert Frank is the lead investigator for the Pfizer COVID-19 children's vaccine clinical trial at the Cincinnati Children's Hospital, which is the first to test on children in the U.S.
Almost 30,000 adults have been enrolled in the study so far, and we have then a pretty good idea as far as with the safety of the vaccine and the immune response to vaccines to where we felt comfortable to move down into children.
Dr. Frank says the Pfizer adult trials are seeing some promise without huge side effects. About 13% of adults enrolled experience fatigue, joint aches, or muscle aches, like when some people get a flu shot. He also says children's studies require fewer volunteers. They started testing on 12-year-olds last week and on older children last month.
Feels good, definitely, to be helping them put out a vaccine as soon as possible and just to be helping in any way I can right now.
Part of the thing with COVID, where it's been so different from a lot of things, is the pandemic, is that so many people becoming infected and dying. And so that's why we really have pushed forward with children fairly quickly.
COVID-19 has killed far more adults than children, but children are still able to spread the disease. That's why the American Academy of Pediatrics supports starting these clinical trials now.
If we want to achieve any level of herd immunity, we're going to need to aim to vaccinate as much of the population as possible, and that includes children.
A working COVID vaccine can help kids go back to school, and it can protect them from unknown long-term effects of the coronavirus. But one way to protect children now, says Dr. O'Leary, is to be up to date with other vaccines.
We don't have a safe, effective COVID vaccine yet, and particularly not for children. But we do have a lot of other safe and effective vaccines for children for diseases that are actually, for children, far more serious than SARS-CoV-2.
Kat Sandoval, Newsy, Chicago.
I think it's time for a little heart-to-heart. We don't ask this much, but how y'all doing? For real, like, how's it going? Because I've been a little stressed, and I know I'm not the only one. A new report from the American Psychological Association tells us that most Americans are feeling that way. Newsy's Lindsay Thie spoke with experts on the matter to discuss exactly what is stressing us out and, another important factor, how to cope.
Protests, politics,
not an idea.
And the pandemic. They're the biggest thing stressing out the majority of us, according to a new report from the American Psychological Association.
When you have multiple stresses that are compounded, then that definitely makes it much more difficult for you to navigate, your day-to-day life.
The APA study found nearly 2 in 3 adults say the current amount of uncertainty in our nation causes them stress. Further, 3 in 5 say the number of issues America faces currently is overwhelming. Nearly 8 in 10 adults say the coronavirus pandemic is a significant source of stress in their life. And 2 in 3 adults say their stress levels have risen over the course of the pandemic. And with the election looming, more than 3 in 4 adults say the future of our nation is a significant source of stress, up from 66% of adults that said the same thing last year.
That state of uncertainty, what's going to happen next, elevates stress overall. I'm concerned about what the long-term impact is going to be, particularly for younger people.
Psychologists Newsy spoke with say how we're coping is also so important right now. They suggest things like texting your friend that you can't see in person, self-care like sleeping and staying hydrated, or even giving a shoulder massage to the person you live with.
You want to be mindful of not drinking too much caffeine and alcohol, because that is going to make your stress levels much more difficult.
Look for ways to also try to relax and to release some of the tension that we're all walking around with. That's an important way to cope as well.
And another thing they advise, which this one might sound strange coming from a news source, limiting your news intake, especially as the election nears, can be beneficial too.
I can control how much I'm exposed to it. If I'm really stressed about news about the economy, I can control how much I'm following economic feeds. Many people are very concerned about what the outcome of the election will be. If that's you, don't spend November 3rd checking the news constantly, because we're not going to have an answer immediately. Make a plan to do things that are satisfying and enjoyable to you instead.
Lindsay Thies, Newsy, Denver.
If you haven't already, feel free to hit us up on Twitter using the hashtag NewsyInTheLoop. I gotta warn you, my Twitter feed is 50% news and 50% nonsense like me retweeting content from the movie Hereditary. I'm still freaked out. Over the past few weeks, you may have seen people posting hashtag #EndSARS on social media. SARS stands for the Nigerian Special Anti-Robbery Squad, meant to crack down on crime, but they're accused of committing the same violent acts they were tasked to curtail. Earlier this month, Nigeria's president called for SARS to be disbanded, but that's done little to stop protests and the violent government crackdown of those demonstrations. Newsy's Amber Strong has more.
The uproar over police brutality has reached a boiling point in Nigeria.
In the incidents in Lagos alone, 12 people had lost their lives.
The military allegedly shot at peaceful protesters on October 20th. Government officials contend there were no casualties. Here's what we do know. Multiple people on the ground were live streaming the protest about abusive police at the Lekki toll gate in Lagos before the shooting started. Just before 7 p.m., one streamer's broadcast caught the sound of shooting as protesters sat on the ground chanting and waving Nigerian flags. Other videos shot by protesters show men in army fatigues at the gate during the shooting. In one, a soldier can be seen pushing protesters and kicking a barricade. The Nigerian army denies there were any soldiers at the scene. So how did the protest against police brutality get to this point? Let's go back a little bit. SARS, or the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, started in the 90s as a way to combat crime. Journalist Hilary Naruka tells Newsy they were effective at first, then things took a turn.
They started harassing people, especially young men and women, with beautiful cars and with good dresses, with fancy wristwatches.
He says they would often rob the subjects and that he's witnessed the harassment firsthand.
A young guy was at the bus stop with me. He had his laptop knapsack on him. A vehicle stopped and it was this police officers. They came out and asked him to show them his phone. He showed the phone. They looked through the phone. They were scrolling through the phone to look for something, look for a way to implicate him. But I spoke up and I told them I was a journalist.
Once he said that, the officers left. Tonye Bakari, the editor of the Nigerian newspaper The Guardian, told Newsy he was pulled off a bus at gunpoint and interrogated.
And I showed them my ID card, my press ID card. The only thing that saved me that day was my press ID card. I can't imagine what would have happened to me if I didn't have that ID card with me.
Amnesty International recorded more than 80 incidents of abuse in 3 years. They say SARS routinely used torture and brutality to extract information from victims. In 2020, things came to a head after a police shooting of a man outside of a Lagos hotel. Social media influencers and musicians like Don Jazzy began calling for protests using the hashtag #InSARS. U.S. celebrities like Kanye West, Trey Songz, and Chance the Rapper also began sounding the alarm. Nigerians around the world have also joined in protest. Local officials say they are looking into the October 20th shooting.
No sitting governor controls the rules of engagement of the military. I have nonetheless instructed an investigation.
SARS disbanded in early October, but protesters say that won't solve the problem if the same officers are just moved to other units, like the newly formed SWAT.
Nobody was fired. No name was put out as the name of someone to be prosecuted.
People don't trust Nigerian police. That's the biggest issue that the police will have. Whether you have a SARS squad or you have SWAT.
Amber Strong, Newsy.
Is it us, or has this election year been a little weird? What with the virtual conventions and the super spreader political rallies and the talk of voting early, voting by mail, etc. It's all enough to make you ask, is voting the old-fashioned way still an option everywhere? Newsy's Stephanie Liebergen has the answers.
Will precincts be open in every state on Election Day?
In-person voting will look very similar in some states to how it always looks, and in some states it'll look pretty different.
Election Day polling places will be open in almost every state. The one exception is Oregon, where elections are held completely by mail. 8 other states in Washington, D.C. are also conducting an all-mail election this November, but in-person voting is still an option for those who want to vote that way. However, the number of open precincts might be different than previous elections because of the coronavirus pandemic. With the push for voters to mail in their ballots, Maryland is one state using vote centers instead of individual precincts.
So these aren't going to be the neighborhood voting sites, but any voter in the county can go to any of those county vote sites to cast a ballot on Election Day.
Regardless of where you live, it's all electronic, so they can pull up your specific ballot so that you get in your correct school zone, etc. If, say, a voting center is closer to your workplace or where you drop off the kids for school.
If you plan to vote in person, best practice is to double check where you're supposed to go.
And remember that just because you went to a particular place to vote in the primary does not guarantee that that same polling place and location will be open and available to you on Election Day.
Stephanie Liebergen, Newsy, Miami.
All right, that's it for us, gang. As always, thanks for watching. We'll be back tomorrow with more In the Loop. Same time, same place. More top stories from Newsy are headed your way right now.